Hello and welcome to Kodsnack, this time in English because I'm joined by Harald Achitz. Is that how you say your name?
Achitz.
Achitz, yes. So Harald is a person I've known for a while now, mainly from the C++ meetup here in Stockholm. And we've talked before about doing an episode together, so I'm glad that it's finally happening. So Harald is originally from Vienna, Austria, if I'm correct. Is that right? So maybe you can introduce yourself briefly, why you're into programming and your background a little bit, and we can take it from there.
Okay, so this is why I'm into programming. It's a long story. So I'm pretty old. So in the podcast you don't see, but if you would see me, you could guess that I have a little bit of longer history. And it started basically in the early 80s, where there was a little bit of computer hype when films like Tron and war games came up. And at this time in schools, there was a little bit that the topic computers are great, but not as in other countries in Austria. Because you need to understand the setup in Austria in the 80s. It was not in the center of Europe. It was on the side of Europe. We were surrounded on three sides from the Iron Gate.
Right.
So hypes had to come to Germany, and then from Germany, if they hyped there and someone could earn money, they came swapped to Austria. So it was a little bit special this time. But the computer stuff happened, and I had a few friends. They had parents working in the industry, and they had computers at home. And with some of them, I spent quite some time in front of their computers, which then mostly turned out always into gaming, because what else to do if you're 13 years old or so. So, and in school, we actually tried to get this as a volunteer subject in school. And I was in a pretty huge school with about 1,200 school kids or students, as I say. It was from the age of 10 to the age of 18, so the whole gymnasium was there.
Yeah.
But we haven't got enough children in the class that this happened. So we were just 10. So this didn't happen.
Right.
So they postponed the budget to buy computers, basically 2 years. And after 2 years, I was already in a different school because I decided to focus on music.
Aha. So what was your musical journey? What instrument do you play? Or
yes, so with one thing I didn't have a computer myself was I started and stopped a lot of things as a child. So I knew when I asked for something very expensive, I needed good arguments. And with computers, I wasn't so sure. Well, I was sure I don't need to ask because this will not stick with me. But what I did from 6 years on was kind of attached to music. So it was my first music school with 6 years. But then I always had a little bit of instrument. And with 10 years, I started guitar. And it was first just purely classical and traditional. And then with 14, I get other influence in, like a little bit of rock and roll, rock, and this stuff. And then, of course, this became much cooler. So I changed to a school where music became my main subject.
Right.
And this was a good idea with 14. But when I became a little bit older, already before the final exam, I wasn't really lucky with this anymore, with this decision.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to play an instrument for fun and play what you enjoy, and for people. When you hang around with friends, you make the background music for you on the evening for 2 hours or so, and just jamming around. But when it's really to play in front of an audience, it is repetition.
Right.
And it's also, you need to be a little bit an actor. Right? If you make a song which transports some feeling, and when it's a happy song and you have a blues day, then it's not. You feel a little bit like a liar. At least I did. So I became a little bit of unhappy with this choice. But made the final exam, and I also made the test for conservatorium. But when I was there, I totally saw that, wow, that's not an option, right? There is no way to make money with this. The way to make money is to teach others to, as children of where parents want them to learn something, right? And teach them as a young student, or you play party music for parties private, where you play the songs you hate. In front of drunken peoples, and this was not an option for me, and I wanted to earn money also. So, and I applied for office jobs, and this was at the very beginning of the 90s.
Right.
And there were computers in offices, so I had 2 jobs where I was the young person, basically.
Right. Okay. So the office job was not to manage computers. It just happened that they had computers.
It was. There have been computers there, and they just dropped in and became important. So the one thing was timetabling for public transport.
Right.
Which is a very living thing, which constantly changed because construction areas, summer, winter, things changed. And back this time, there was no SL app where you looked when there's the next traveling. You needed paper.
Yeah.
And this paper needed constantly to be updated. And this happened already on computers. So you made the work with the hand and what is changing. And then you went to a terminal and created basically the timetables.
Right.
And there was a little bit of validation in the background.
So what was the computers that you had at that time?
I had no idea, honestly. It was just a terminal to some data center.
Right, so it's some mainframe.
Yes, mainframe. And since I was the young guy, once a month I took the tapes. So it was real big tapes and brought them to another data center for which else these things went into print.
Right.
And then after 1 year I changed to something else that was a little bit insurance-like, but the situation was the same. A lot of things was you calculated for insurance stuff for people.
Right.
And used the terminal to get help. And I find it great because these things did my work for me. and there were also Office PCs came to the desktop with very early Word versions.
Right.
And after I had a little bit enough and of working of these jobs because I wanted to become a programmer.
Right. That's what I was going to ask. Like, was there any programming involved? Was it just...
Yes. So there was a little bit of automation involved. And I think my first real stuff I wrote that was usable was Word Basic, which was a preset of Visual Basic for application.
Yeah.
So, and I wanted to go more into the programming and working with computers and managing the computers because I used them at home also for gaming at this time already. So there have been today you would say boot camps, but they were a little bit different. We had from the Institute for Economic Promotion of the Austrian Economic Chambers, which is a very fancy name, but basically the companies that make the economic lobbying, they created courses, IT courses and computer courses, because they needed people that make the stuff that people from university didn't want to do. So more craftsmanship. And I made some of these courses. So it was you qualify for one course and then you get like a stipendium for another course.
Right.
And then the next one. And I did some of these courses. They were quite cool.
So what was the programming experience doing those courses? Was it COBOL, I can imagine?
No. It was databases, SQL, and Visual Basic, and a little bit of C.
I see.
So the first one was computer general, and then I had a network administration education for NT and Novell, because network was still a thing back then.
Right.
So I spent quite some time, and I wanted to become programmer, but this was on the path, on the education path.
Right.
But the last one was done programming with databases, and then I did an additional thing because I did already a little bit of not serious freelancing, then in between and a side project for people that needed a little bit help. It was mostly teaching stuff then. But I did then also additional education because it was very clear that when I want to make programming, I need to understand what offices need. Right. And then so I made a little bit of accounting and cost controlling education, which was also a little bit sponsored, and you could work like an interim job for several months to real accounting. So at this time I could really work as accounting, because a lot of the software that was transformed in the mid-90s was, the accounting stuff and the thing. And this really took off then with you could say with Windows 95 and NT 351. So where Office 95 came on the desktop and the internet became a thing. Right, this was then the time where everyone got a computer on the desk, basically.
Yeah.
And this was where I then started to freelance.
Right.
As a maybe automation engineer, you would say, this day, going into the office and say, well, human, you shouldn't do this should do a computer for you.
Right, yeah.
And you could make people with very simple things happy back then.
So you were freelancing already back in 95. So
yeah, because I didn't know what to do.
Right.
It was an accident. So I fixed things right for people, and they recommended me, and then it became you could make a little bit money without worrying too much, but then it becomes so much that I needed to make a declaration for the Skatteverket, it was Swedish.
Right, yeah.
For the finance things to not get in troubles, and it was like I was very bad freelance, I have to say. Yes, because first of all, I never cared about money. I always cared about the next job should be something I have no clue about.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes, so I couldn't charge as much as time hours as time I needed, because I have no idea, but I do it right.
So how did you find customers? Did you get recommendations from?
Yeah, so I always tried to have happy customers. Yeah. So this is something what was very important back then to be recommended.
Yeah.
But it ended up becoming too much, right? So because even if mobile phones became a thing, right? The first thing when I started, I didn't even have a mobile phone. So when some customer from the old project called for a question, and I came home from the new customer in the evening, I heard it on the mailbox, then I needed to call the next day. So the loops were pretty long, so this was not optimal. And then even when mobile phones turned on, became a thing, and I had one, you couldn't be with one customer and talk with another customer.
Right, yeah.
So this was really difficult. So I did this just for some years, and then I stopped. But in these years, I did everything with Microsoft stuff, because I loved the Microsoft environment, the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And to the reason, because it has been available everywhere in the companies, they had it.
Yeah.
Except some, they had a lot of smart suites. But and the other thing was Microsoft Press, the books from Microsoft, which have been translated into German. And these books were fantastic. So I had very many of them, and I worked through them to learn all the stuff about the Microsoft software.
Yeah. I mean, things were quite different if you look at like 95 to 2000. I mean, I was also using Microsoft stuff because Linux was still not really a serious platform if you wanted to do business stuff, and Mac OS was nothing. I mean, it was before the iPhone. They were gone. So at least in Europe. So yeah, I think most people were using Microsoft stuff then. But you were still doing BASIC then for like the programming wise.
The programming was BASIC, and I preferred Visual Basic for application. So what was inbuilt in Office, because it gave you more controls.
Yeah.
And the most thing was that there was a database involved, because I really loved the databases.
Right.
And then visualizing the data diagrams in Excel and reporting, making nice things, customer databases, things like this.
Right.
Were the thing, and then combining with templates and Office templates and macros that did things.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people will talk bad about, oh my God, Basic, but I think that's actually it was very valuable for a lot of people.
I mean, the Visual Basic environment for making graphical applications back then was really nice. I mean, it was one of those, you could draw the UI and then just click a button and write a little bit of code that you needed for the button. And yeah, it was actually...
There was a nice debugger, which you could step through stuff, change things. And the things that they created back then, they created value for companies. Where I had a customer, for example, where I created some Access database. And they put them and they said that when you become more than 10 users, you should call me because then we have to do something, right? And several years later, they said, oh, we want the web version. I said, wait, you still use this? You're 50 plus persons and you still use this? One Access file shared on a network share? Yeah, why not? It works, right? So, of course, it had then some issues, right? But these were how things were. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everything was quite new still. In a way.
But yeah, so after some years, I stopped the freelancing part because I said I was bad at it, and became employed in a company making POS software, and they had a very interesting also production database,
right?
Which I wasn't allowed to touch because it was running on an IS 400, so only IBM people were allowed to do that. And then they prepared the data and pushed the data to the SQL server, Microsoft SQL.
Right.
But then I could play with it, and I was a little bit, why can I not play with this database? So I thought, okay, I should become consultant again. And became again consultant, but this time under umbrella organization. So like your own company, but attached to a bigger one.
So when did you discover C++?
Oh, this is some years to go. Right. The thing was, I started again as a consultant, and through this company I had access to the really big companies and big databases. Yeah. This became really interesting. But also the 90s starts to end, and what happened was Java was popping up.
Yeah.
And for me, it was, it's nice programming language, but business-wise, it's marketing bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I had a real problem communicating this, because for me it was totally clear, how can you believe what you hear, right?
Yeah.
But management believe it, right? And I became a little bit, I have seen several projects going, we don't use stored procedures, and we make the whole business logic in the extra tier on extra machines and need to scale them, and the project became super expensive, and they were a pain. And I said, this is not the way I want to go.
Yeah.
So I looked a little bit for something different, and I found something like in a medical device startup.
Right.
So and there I could connect these things, because there was a touch screen involved.
Yeah.
So which you put basically close to the medical station, intensive station. And it had a touch screen, but this was connected with something that monitored and also controlled a little bit of perfuser machines.
Right.
Which were connected over serial board. And this was C stuff. And the in-house software of the hospitals has mostly been at this time Java stuff.
So was it all written in C in this device?
No, the front end was, and the business logic was in Visual Basic, but I used DCOM to create interfaces to interface with C.
Yeah.
C++, and then a colleague had the C part to the machines in. So we used DCOM to connect these languages, and this was the first commercial. At this time, I have to say I already played at home with C++ because I started to install Linux And instead of playing computer, I put it into Linux. And instead of playing 3 hours computer games, I looked, what can I do on Linux, right?
Yeah.
And there was C++ was one of the choices I explored there.
Right.
But just for fun. And then there was where I could use it at job. And then I was in this medical device startup, and I ended with several very stressful years because as a consultant and this and then the startup stuff.
I mean, working in the medical industry sounds stressful in itself. That's one of those things that I've always thought that must be really stressful environment where you have, you're gonna have a doctor and someone who's ill on the one end of the machine, and it has to work. If there's a problem, it's gonna cause real issues. But,
yeah, it is like this the case, but usually as a developer, you're not so confronted with this because you have a lot of. I came back to medical devices later, even if I said after this experience, after my first one, never again.
Yeah.
But when it's a very high regulated environment where a lot of things don't change and testing is expensive.
I mean, I can imagine there's a lot of restrictions as well.
Exactly, you need to apply a lot of rules, which is a honeypot for developer of a certain mindset.
Right.
and it's often so that in these environments you have one developer and two. They often are called software architecture, but they do nothing else than requirement engineering for the various local legal laws you need to obey. When you ship a medical device to Europe, it's different than US, then it's different to Africa, it's different to China, but not so. It's a very complicated regulatory thing. So you don't feel that you're so connected to the patient on this side. You're more connected to all this regulatory stuff and the slowness of the process.
Right.
But in the startup, it was a little bit different, even if we had also to fulfill. But it was not the goal of the company owner. What I at the end learned was to get bought by another company, right?
Well, I mean, isn't that most companies nowadays? You just hope to be bought out. Yeah.
I just worked a lot to have this product up in a good state, and it was running in a hospital.
Yeah.
And then some other company bought it, and would you like to go to Switzerland? And I said no, just married, and I don't want to leave Vienna.
Right.
And also the whole thing, I wanted to change something.
Yeah.
So I decided at this time, because through these medical devices, I came together with people that were working on Linux, and I said, actually, this I like there is a different spirit in the Linux world.
Yeah.
More than how you share knowledge.
Right.
In the Microsoft world, there were also, but it was very, how to say, niche, this open knowledge sharing. Everything else is, I figured out how it works, I tell you enough, but not everything. A little bit, it was my impression from a lot of people. There was this Linux people. And the other thing was, of course, that you install a Linux distribution and wow, you don't need to pay for an MSDN subscription and you have everything, all the tools. I mean, okay, there was no cool IDE. But there have also not been other problems, right? And the documentation was just there, and you can just use it.
Yeah.
And you can look into the source code. And for me, as always learning myself, and constantly learning, this was of course great, right? Yeah. And after the medical device stuff, I said, actually, I want to make a living on open source with Linux.
Yeah.
And being a developer, but it was very clear to me that I cannot put myself on the market and say, hey, I want to develop for Linux. Actually, I did, and one company was very sarcastic, and I wish I would like it. But what I did at this time, I since I always had a little bit of foot in the administrative part, I did firewalls.
Ah.
So there was Linux on a floppy disk, for example.
Yeah.
And people needed firewalls.
Right.
Because this was the time where the first bad things happened via the internet. And I started to make simple IP table for them, what was at this time enough, later not, right? But this opened a door for me, and through this, when I made an installation for a place,
right,
I got the contract for being able to do stuff as a where I said, okay, Linux is my development platform.
Right. So you were kind of starting a startup at that point, you could say.
Well, you cannot say. I said I'm not a very good businessman, right? It was more. I'm super stubborn. I say I want to make a living from Linux. So for a long time I had Linux as a second system on the computer, and then I was okay. I wipe away Microsoft Free soon, because otherwise I will not learn it.
Right.
And I had always a second Microsoft computer for customers and so on. But then I really switched everything to Linux, and it was a difficult time.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, when was this time-wise?
It was shortly after 2000.
Right. Yeah.
So it was a little bit of period. It was not so. But I ended up then with at home. I said, okay, I know everything at Linux, and after the medical device job, I said I want to earn money with this. And
right.
then what could I do? I could make 5-share machines, Samba server, without you need to pay an MT license and the firewall stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, okay, I start with this and going into companies, and when I'm in the companies,
I think I lost you.
I started to drop into C++ because I made arcade machines and other game machines.
So apologies. I think our connection dropped out for a second.
Yeah, I had this yellow bar on the...
yes. But it seems to be back now. Okay, so this is when you started with C++. Were you using KDE at the time?
I was using KDE 2 at the time. I was never a stable person. I was always switching around stuff. I started with KDE 2. Then when they shipped to KDE 3, I went to GNOME, also because I switched to Red Hat at this time. From I think I started with OpenSUSE, and there was KDE. Then I switched to Red Hat. Then I was long at Red Hat. Then GNOME switched to version 2, and then KDE 3 was stable enough. So I went to KDE 3 and moved pretty long to KDE 3. Then there was the big disappointment with the transition to KDE 4.
Yeah.
which was rather
it's the downside with Linux is all the the user interface experimentation, both with GNOME and KDE, where every other version, it seems, they decide to try something completely different, and it's not always successful.
I have no problems if things work, but sometimes they didn't. And this was extremely... I mean, luckily, my Linux distribution of choice at this time, then after the Red Hat stuff, and so became Slackware, and Slackware doesn't change a lot. so I had my stable Slackware environment. Also because I use Slackware as a base for I wouldn't say embedded system, but very slim Linux installations, which I made to run arcade games on it and other games. So I had
I was gonna say, like, when you were doing these installations, were you shipping them kind of in a data center somewhere, like a...
No, they were this thing where in machines, in embedded machines, in arcade machines, and game terminals, basically. Yeah. So things like this. So I did a little bit there of everything, like looking the Linux installation slimmed down, and then the program running on it, and then running, trying to what it works, but graphically applications on the frame buffer, and a little bit on the X. Just starting X with one application, which is your application, which takes over the whole desktop. Yeah. Things like this. And for the application part, C++ became my language of choice.
Yeah. Right.
And since then, it's Linux and C++.
Right, basically. And this was mid-2000s then, I guess.
It started actually in 2003. The whole journey where I definitely switched and so I started to earn money again as a freelancer.
Yeah.
And I was again very bad in it. But I have to say I had a little bit support at the beginning. I still made for example, teaching as trainer for Microsoft SQL as well.
Right.
So there was a little bit of transition phase where I still used my Microsoft skill to make a little bit of money and to support the other thing I wanted to do, because I think they make more fun.
Yeah.
And it's always something to learn, right? If I would be clever and follow the money, I would have become maybe a DBA.
Definitely,
for SQL Server. But yeah, this was then where I say, okay, when the option is going this, let's start something new and go to the Linux world.
Yeah. And, that's cool though. It's definitely following your passion.
Yeah, I didn't regret it, I have to say. It was sometimes difficult, but I also it's the foundation what I am today.
Well, I mean, I think history has proven you right, and at least with Linux. Like now, even Microsoft is switching everything over to Linux. So.
Yeah, that's true. So from history wise, I was there at the time when Microsoft said Linux is a cancer.
Right. Yeah.
And what was it, SGO? So we wish you all Linux users around the planet and things like this. But also when IBM stepped in and made the Linux advertisement, right? This was the other side, which was there was great hope in this thing also.
Yeah. I mean, Microsoft was the big devil if you were in the Linux world before, they completely switched. But yeah, so when did you decide to move to Sweden? How did that come about?
Yeah, this was a little bit so 2010.
Yeah. So
I was living very long in the same living place with a home office, where I worked a lot from home and this was like I wanted to see something different, and I was working for a company, and after this phase, I had the possibility to work remote a little bit,
right,
and I said, okay, let's make a half year, like in Sweden you would say sabbat year, right?
Yeah.
So and my wife also, she came to Austria and was 10 years at the same company, and she wanted to do something different. So we decided to make a half year off and go to Sweden, because we made a vacation off in Sweden. So my wife is from Finland, so we had to the Nordic countries a little bit of relation.
Yeah.
And stay there over winter and see what happens, right?
Right, yeah.
And we came in October, and after 1 month walking around, so let's send out a few applications. And then 1st of December we both start to work.
Wow, okay.
In Sweden.
So yeah, that's great. I mean, I would have assumed that it would be like, oh, I got a job in Sweden and a job, but it was the other way around.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't want to work, but then it became a little bit boring, and we said, let's try, let's see what happens. And I think it's easier to get a job if you either have a job or not really look for something.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Then things just happen. When you're desperate in need for an assignment or a job, then usually it's much harder.
Yeah. No. Exactly. It's a bit unfair, but yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah, so after, I had to go back to Austria and get rid of the living place we had there, and decide what to bring to Sweden. And since then, I'm in Sweden. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So it is 10 years now this year in October.
Right. Yeah, and you were working at Electrolux, right?
No.
Was that the place?
Electrolux assignment is already over since some months. I'm now at Tobii.
Ah, right, yes. The eye tracking company.
Eye tracking, world leading eye tracking solution provider. Yeah. So, but I'm a freelancer here in Stockholm now.
Right. So are you getting into graphics and that kind of thing?
Oh no, actually not. I'm in something that is called Core team.
Right.
And it's about software design for all components that are used to find common patterns and try to get common software architecture and reusable components over time, and a good continuous delivery experience. Good build environment, because they have very many build platforms.
So are you introducing Conan to
now we use their Bazel, and it's very interesting.
Right.
This is a topic I became more and more interested in the last years, because I spent really a lot of time with just C++ and focusing on all the corner cases.
Yeah.
But at some point of time, several years ago, I started, it's not just the code I write, right? It is also what happens at the moment when I do a commit.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Because what I didn't want to have is you do the commit, and then, it builds, and then it goes to some testing and some manual testing, let's say medical devices, right? Yeah. And 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, you get back, hey, there is another issue with this thing, and you say, oh, what did I do 3 weeks back, right? Yeah, and you lose a whole day to just get the context in your head. And this is things where I said, this needs to change.
Yeah, yeah.
And the embedded and the C++ world has to catch up on this topic.
Right, I was going to say, it's a little bit interesting because, I've kind of done the same journey with getting into CI, CD, that kind of thing, coming from a background of C++, where, especially if you're using C++ in Linux, first of all, you have the package manager built into the OS, so it's like not even something you consider, it's just part of the environment. And then, of course, C++ doesn't have anything. You don't even have modules or a build system. You have to provide everything from the outside. So it's really a different way of seeing things, whereas I think a lot of people coming from a different background, especially with Java and these things, where you have much more integrated tooling for package management and modules and managing dependencies. So it's a different way of thinking. But that's interesting. So when did you start with doing this kind of continuous integration stuff? And did you start using Jenkins somewhere? Or
it is also I relatively early started with extreme testing.
Right.
So I was I'm pretty strong for unit tests, and I started test-driven development very many years back.
Oh wow!
Mostly because when I made this arcade games and other games, some of them were about money.
Yeah.
And being your own company responsible for the quality of the code, it changed the perspective. When you deliver something and when you create a financial damage, you might have to pay a little bit of your money.
Right.
So you develop a mindset where it's not the question, am I paranoid? It's the question if am I paranoid enough? And in this time I learned that and it was not just my invention, right? It was also the time where extreme programming popped up.
Yeah.
The first things and test-driven development in other branches, other industries came, right? I said, okay, this makes sense, right? And there was already Boost unit test, which I utilized, and and this was basically already the first development in this direction, where I said, okay, using this style of programming is very good because I can see how much it makes me better.
Yeah,
I have to experience how it was before, where I was coding, then starting an application, doing, say it works, and then sending it to the customer, nothing works, right?
Right, yeah.
And then we're having this situation where I said, wow, having this unit test in place that saved me from shipping something that has a bug, because I wouldn't have remembered to test this thing, right? So with this experience and based on this, the next thing is, of course, you want to have fast feedback loops.
Yeah.
So, right. You want to have, and also I want to have everything automated. If I need to do something 3 times, then I write already something that does it for me. Sometimes it's a little bit strange, and I have to slow myself down. but the things, yeah. And I was looking for environments actually very long then, where I say, hey, there is a company that has so many testers, people that should be responsible for this. And why do I still have feedback loops of 2 weeks, right? And it turned out that it is not well implemented very often. For a lot of people, it's called DevOps. It's just another silo beside other silos, with people that don't understand all the sides of a product, right? And for me, coming from having the financial background, because I made my own company so long, and I had a little bit of education, and being a little bit of administrator also for systems and knowing the server software, how this works, understanding the IT department, what their concerns are, understanding the development, right? For me, it was always natural that why doesn't this work, right? It's just, right? And it took me some years to figure out that there are not so many people that have this broad view to the problem set, especially when it comes to embedded thing.
Yeah. Because
you often deal with people, they have just the hardware. 80% they have in mind is hardware, right?
Right.
And then you deal with people that 80% they have there's the regulation framework they need to obey, and you cannot expect that these people they care a lot, right? And
then no one's looking at the whole.
Yeah. And then you look who is making the builds in a lot of companies, and you, as a consultant, you see several places, and it turns out, very often developers that, he's not such a good developer, let him make the builds, or let him make the testing.
Right.
And then this is also not a good setup, right?
Yeah.
And so so this is basically the motivation is I would like to have someone set this up for me.
Yeah.
But no one is doing it. So I needed to look self into it, right? And this is why I created more the interest. What is, at least I know that they involve technique, right? I'm not a Jenkins expert, so there are people that know much more about Jenkins, but I can at least communicate with them because I know what Jenkins is or what GitHub Actions is or things like this. So I can do simple things on these things.
Yeah, but I think it's like you're saying, the most important thing is having that complete view or like holistic thinking of where you don't just get focused on your little part. It's like, the hardware works, but you actually think about what is the end user experience. I also find that that's always lacking where, all the tests are passing, but the thing is not usable. And then what's the point, So you really need to think about that even when you do your testing, so that you're testing the right things and making sure that it's actually working the whole way through. But that's also one of the challenges I was going to bring up, like when you're talking about the unit testing. In my experience, it's easy to get myopic when it comes to unit tests because you're just testing the code. But especially if you're working on embedded device and so on, there's so many externalities, I guess you would say.
Yes, but I hear this often.
Yeah.
And the idea of unit test is testing the code, because if you do something else, it's a system or integration test.
Right, exactly.
So yes, unit tests do what they do. They test the code.
Yeah.
And I also like 100% code coverage, even if I have people, why do you want 100% code coverage? Because it gives you no guarantee for nothing. I said, yes, it gives me no guarantee, but it gives me the guarantee I don't have non-reachable code.
Right.
Because I have experienced this myself, that I have written code implementation, and if this is the case, and if this is the case, right?
Yeah.
And then I was not able to implement the unit test that goes into the code.
Yeah. So how would you implement your unit test to cover that? Because that's one of the difficult parts is where, like you have let's say you have some code that interacts with a remote server in production, or you have a hardware device that it interacts with. And then, of course, you can mock up, the hardware device and do the test against that. But now you're testing your mock-up. You're not testing the actual code that runs.
The integration test, right?
Right. So
and the integration test, you need to have reproducible stuff. Yeah. So where you say and this is, it always ends up to the Horry triple. It doesn't matter if you're on a unit test level or on a system or integration test level, where you say, okay, what is the scenario? What is given? When I do this, then I expect this. Right. And this goes through all things, right? And this is, of course, the question: how do you make this where you have hardware that behaves strange?
Right.
Yeah, you need to fake it, right? I mean, you need to say, okay, what do you mean hardware behaves strange? And then you need to say, okay, let's be prepared that a hardware could return this or that, or trigger this error, and then you need to have something that triggers it. And getting this something, this simulator or whatever it is often very difficult, and this is the place where people give up.
Yeah,
but this is also the place where some companies succeed and some companies not, right?
Right, yeah.
Because, I mean, yeah, it is, of course, difficult, and we don't know how to do, and everything, if you don't have it, you don't know how to do it, because if you would know how to do it, you would have already done it, right?
Yeah.
And doing this first invention and saying, okay, what is actually the thing, is a huge step that is very difficult for a lot of companies. Because then they do, we need this and that, and then they say, we need everything, right? And they don't say, okay, what is the smallest thing we could implement?
Right, yeah.
On automation, what is the smallest use case that we could realize with a simple mock or start, or call it whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
And then I say always, okay, the first step you need to do is creating something like a feature file, where in simple natural language, you describe the problem.
Yeah.
That we all understand the problem, that the manager understands the problem, like the tester, like the implementation person. Yeah. Because very often it turns out these three people talk about total different things, even if they talk about the same.
Right, yeah.
Same stuff. So you need to have a little bit, so what is the scenario? What is given? When this happens, then I expect this, right? And break it down as simple as possible.
Yeah.
And this thinking is it's interesting that it is very, very difficult to get this in place, because even if it sounds simple, it is very difficult.
Right, yeah.
And what are the things, right?
And it's one of the things that I think a lot of people miss, especially so one of the issues I have with a lot of the modern development practices, if we're talking like processes, like Scrum and Agile, is the way that people do it. They tend to overlook this holistic thinking. It becomes very focused on just the next task and breaking things down into small pieces and not really thinking about the whole. It's like, in order to break something down, you have to have something first to break down. But if you start from, we're just coming up with some tasks, and then we run off and we do them, and then we come up with new tasks, no one's stopping and thinking, okay, so are we actually building something coherent?
I mean, we could now make excursus to the various Agile and Scrum implementations in different companies.
Right, yeah.
and I mean, the people that sold Scrum made it very clever, right? Because they said, if it doesn't work for you, then you implement it wrong. So everything we say is basically super. but for a lot of companies, I mean, every company is Agile. But even if they are Agile, a lot of companies haven't changed.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's just a new banner.
and there are various implementation and
yeah.
It is, and one of the things, of course, I see often one of the most difficult thing also in bigger companies is when you talk about this type of testing, it is about going over different teams.
Yeah.
And then, this is something companies very often don't feel very good about, because, what team manager, no, I need to protect my team because we have such a high workload.
Yeah.
And another team manager says the same. And then you say, hey, we need to synchronize. No, you want to put additional workload on me, right?
Right, yeah.
And this is something where you end up into management level, where you say, hey, how do you break up this silo, right?
Yeah.
Adding a new DevOps department with people that know how to run Jenkins, but don't know anything else. Just add another silo.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Right? You will have more problems. So
yeah. And it's so funny because, like, yeah, exactly. The point of Agile was to improve communication and reduce processes and layers. And then the point of DevOps was to unify the dev department with the ops department. But instead, it just ended up creating a new DevOps department that's siloed from everything else. So, yeah, in a lot of organizations,
in
like this.
Some structured is silos, in others maybe not.
Right.
So I would say there are companies that have continuous. I mean, there is also, we need to decide what we're talking about.
Yeah.
It is a total different thing when you make some web application where you say, oh, if it's crash, who cares, right?
Yeah.
So and the other thing where say if it crashes, maybe people will die.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So you cannot make over-the-air updates on medical devices or also cars or whatnot, right? Exactly. There is a little bit of different, but you could apply simply some of the key concepts, right? To make the code flow more efficient and at the end cheaper.
Yeah.
When you, I mean, because what I see, what is all this, and I don't know if this is a common term, but technology first companies and not technology first companies, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the technology first, they make a living with software.
Yeah.
So software is their bread and butter. While the other companies, like the car industry, or whatever appliances and medical devices, they were hardware manufacturers. And they have a tradition that software is, it's not too long ago where a guy told me, hey, software is just here to fix the bugs we do in hardware.
Right, yeah.
And the software was relative small part of the budget, but the hardware was a huge part. And this has totally shifted, right? Yeah. So today you have the hardware often is produced in China and this becomes cheaper over the time.
Yeah.
So if you built the same hardware 5 years ago, and today it's most likely very much cheaper than 5 years ago, while software has exactly the opposite trend, right?
Right. Yeah.
With software, you add, you change, you adapt, and it becomes more and more expensive.
Yeah.
And if you look at the whole product, where you have a hardware part and a software part, the chunk of the software becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah. And for some companies, it's hard to do the transition because they are still in what they know from the hardware producing stuff, which worked good for the hardware, right? There is a lot of companies where I say, wait, the hardware is good, but the software sucks.
Yeah.
And getting this transition right is of course, I mean, it's easy for us to stand here and finger point and say, yo, that would just need to do, right?
Yeah.
Because implementing this is in a company is very hard thing. Yeah. Because even if the people in the company are not happy, because very often they feel, oh, we don't produce the best quality and we always get so many back reports and we got blamed that our quality is not good enough, right? So they are very often not happy. So if you ask them if they want change, they will say yes. Right. If you ask them who wants to change, no one of them wants to change, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because at the end, they all have found their comfort zone, in which they can make their 8-hour days or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
80% of the people and go with this through their career. So implementing this in companies of this size, which goes over different teams, over different nations, if the company is even bigger, right? It's a very difficult question, actually.
Yeah.
Which I find nearly as interesting as writing code. Because with writing code with C++, okay, from time to time there is a new standard, and I look at it, and you use the new features wrong, and then I find out how to use it, and then I master it, right?
Yeah.
and I know how to make this buses, but the other thing is also very, very complex, and it's also development, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I think I've had the same experience over time, is that all the difficult problems, like really difficult problems in software development, are organizational and social first, and not really code problems. Like,
It was a little bit hard for me also to realize that the code I write is most likely not important.
Right.
Which is very, for a developer, very sad when you start to realizing this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also the case, like the less code you have, the less you have to test. So it's in two ways.
Not just this, but the software systems tend to change.
Yeah.
And evolve. And if there is, if you have a core component, a fixed set of libraries that don't change, then this is of course the case. But a lot of the softwares, you write it today, and then another developer will take it over and need to change it.
Yeah.
And the code you write today will not be there in 5 years. Yeah. Hopefully, right? So for a lot of the applications, the things will change.
Yeah, I think that's my view as well, is that code is temporary. I think, and I think that is one of the issues that were a problem with the way software was presented or developed in the 90s and 2000s, like when Java came and all this, where the focus was on reusing code. Everyone was thinking that code was so valuable that we wanted all these ways of writing code once and then we can just use it over and over. But in reality,
super smart framework,
right,
that never turned out to be that smart.
Right. It turns out you actually just have to write code and throw it away as soon as possible because everything changes. Yeah.
So if you can, for me, it was always when a customer comes to me and I learned very early that the first specification you get from a customer is not what the customer finally wants, right?
Right.
So this I had to learn very, very early, and I also paid for it. but the thing became for me very early that when a change is requested, is it, oh my god, this will, no. Or will you be able to say, yes, it is a little bit of work, but we are able to do it? Yeah. And for saying yes, you need automated testing. Right. On as many levels, because otherwise, except for a Hello World program, when you say change a Hello World program to Goodbye World, then obviously not, right? But today's software projects, they're all a little bit bigger. Yeah. And you need to be aware that when you change something on this place, that everything else just works. Yeah. And doing this also for the developer that comes after you, that the developer that takes over the code you write today has a playground to try out things, feel safe, in a safe environment, right? So creating this test is also giving a fail-safe environment. This is a very buzzword, giving a safe environment. Yeah. But we need as developers think also, how can I make a fail-safe environment for people that come after me or for my colleagues? And testing, and having a testing that is not just assert. Yeah. This does describe nothing, because what are you actually testing, right? This is a function that takes 500 asserts. It's not testing, right? Right. But if you have like a given when then, where you translate this a little bit, it tells you much more of a story. Right. Yeah. It tells you the intent. Yeah, I think that's also one of the things that I think is really nice. If you have good unit testing, good testing in general, that tells a story about how whoever wrote the code expected it to be used as well. So you get kind of the context where, like everyone says, like, oh, write a lot of comments. And of course, documentation is important. I happen to think, I don't think code comments is that important. I think documentation in general is important. But I also think that comments and documentation tend to drift away from the actual implementation. And it's really valuable to have in the code form something that, that gets run in the continuous integration and keeps, remains up to date, that actually documents the intent and the purpose of the code. And if you have simple test cases that are very readable and super simple for interface, you can actually say, run this test case and then include this testing code in the Doxygen documentation, for example.
Right.
Then you have a guarantee that the code you actually showcase to explain something compiles.
So I know that Rust, in their documentation system, if you write code in a comment, it will actually, when it's building the documentation, run and test the code and make sure that the code works. So you get documentation, but you also get this this drive to keep things working in the examples and so on.
You have this with doc test in Python also.
Right.
Where it takes so this is this is documentation is this Schrödinger cat thing. Everyone wants to have it, but no one reads it.
Right. Yeah.
So if it's never enough, but it's always too much. When you write documentation, I cannot read a book, right? Show me the code. And if you don't write anything and just show the code, where is the documentation?
Exactly.
So it is. So my point of view is always document the public interface.
Yeah.
A little bit descriptive and document it with unit test. Tell a little bit the story, what these things are doing.
Yeah.
With feature descriptions. And this is the best solution I can come up. I know this is work where it's not easy to understand why this work pays off, because you need to follow a whole life cycle of a project to see these things pay off.
Right.
And very often for a developer, hey, I'm good in implementing the code and I have no problem. If you tell me 2 weeks later what the problem is, I will just fix it and throw one implementation after the other.
Yeah.
But this is exactly what you don't want to have in the throwing things over the wall in how to call it, modern development environments.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So tearing down the walls is what actually the DevOps movement is also, right? Not I write something and throw it in the face of the software tester. So getting here a little bit better. And this is a cultural shift. And they said people like change, but they don't want to change. So getting a developer who was never used and hasn't experienced himself or herself, why this pays off, why and for a lot of developers, honestly said it doesn't pay off because they're sitting in the 8-hour job, the dark matter developer, right? And it doesn't matter for them.
Yeah, I think it's a big concern. Like that's one of the issues I have too. I think a lot of developers are very comfortable not having to worry about the lifetime of their project and then counting on when problems come back to them and they just get angry or they're no longer around. I think it's really important to have that complete view.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.